Hey class, welcome back to Strategies of Missions and Leadership Development. Last time we looked at colonial missional strategy, and today we're going to finish up our look at the history of strategies that are dealing with missions, and we're going to be looking at the 19th century missional strategy. This is a century that is very busy for missions because many agencies and societies begin to develop and pop up all over the place, and then also the Europeans, mainly in England, but other Europeans also spread all around the world to take the gospel. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay, class, we're now moving into strategies of missions and leadership development, and this lecture is on session 9, which is 19th century mission strategy. And we have some introductory material there on the screen for you. Some Europeans protested the colonization of new lands. There was obviously the spreading of nations going around the world, especially by the 1800s. And Queen Victoria became very well known to rule over an empire where the sun never set, meaning the British Empire. And the colonization of new lands, there was some controversy with what was taking place. So some people did protest. However, most and even sincere Christians agreed with the colonization and the benefits that the Europeans could bring to these new lands that were conquered or taken over by European powers. Many viewed that God had given white Europeans the gospel for the purpose of taking it to the heathen. Therefore, colonization was the way to take the Bible to the lost. So they viewed colonization as in taking over a country or a people group or a land as something to do with God's work, where the gospel can also go with it. And so what this looks like is what is called white man's burden. This is what the Europeans believed, that it was their responsibility to take the benefits of industrialization, capitalism, democracy, and Christianity to the world. And so they viewed it their responsibility to do this. And it's not just Christianity like with missionaries, but obviously industrialization, meaning goods and manufacturing, to capitalism and the way a free market works, to democracy, the way a government works. And so these new lands were colonized with that in mind. Missionaries have been blamed for colonization. However, it was the European powers that colonized for many reasons. Of course, most of it was economically. They would look at a land to see what gain they can get as a country. And so they would colonize an area and take the wealth back to the mother nation. So wherever it is, whether that be the Belgian Congo, where whatever resources could be found in the Congo would go back to Belgium, or whatever could be found in, let's say, South Africa. Diamond mines and gold mines, they could be taken back to Great Britain. So mostly it's economic, but it's also geopolitical power that was going on. There was definitely the political game that was being played between European powers on these distant lands and on these distant continents. And the missionaries would then follow suit, and they would come into a colonized area. And of course, at times it was almost simultaneous that the government or the country was moving into a colonized area, and the missionaries were right there with them. But one of the things that we see in the 19th century is early mission societies begin to pop up. And many times it was along denominational lines. We have a list here of actually some early missionary societies before the 19th century. You see the 1698 Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, which was Anglican. 1701 Society for Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, Anglican. 1792 Particular Baptist Society for Propagating the Gospel. And later on, this was called the Baptist Missionary Society, which William Carey would go under that organization to India. 1795, the London Missionary Society, which was Congregationalist, and then 1799, the Church Missionary Society, and 1804, the British and Foreign Bible Society. Those are early ones, and during the 19th century, there's going to be many different mission societies that pop up and promote and endorse missionaries to go across the world. Well, the Western governments took very little interest in the mission movement. So the European powers, they went out and they were settling lands and colonizing lands, and they weren't overly concerned about missions. It was more of the religious side of a movement, but very few churches would actually give to this feat of sending missionaries to, let's say, Africa as a church. Usually it was just individuals who had become interested in missions and funding missions, and they would give their support. They found it very interesting to give support to missions work that was moving around in exotic places, and they could have some kind of a piece in that by funding a missionary to go, let's say, to some Pacific island somewhere and promote the gospel there. Also, many women rose up and had a great role in agency missional support. First, what it was most women missionaries were just the wives of a male missionary. So their husband was a missionary, so they're along for the ride. They were viewed as women missionaries. But then many women would also go to the mission field to be nurses, teachers, to care for children. So you started seeing more single women going to mission, following these European nations that colonized these areas around the world. So let's look here at Asia. At first, colonial expansion was in the India's subcontinent, which is what we call India today. Early on, it was Catholic, but later it came under a lot of Protestant influence. And the British East India Company, which was Anglican, they basically came to rule all of India. But after 100 years, it ruled most of the eastern coast of India. In 1858, the British government took all of Indian territory, and Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. So this is where Great Britain really starts to settle down and settle into India, and that's going to go all the way up to the 20th century, almost the mid-20th century, when India gets its independence. But for several centuries, the British government was in control of India, and obviously the missionaries followed there also. Okay, so let's continue on here. We're going to be looking at William Carey, 1761 to 1834. He is known as the father of modern missions. He was actually a trained shoemaker, and he was first an apprentice, and then he became a shoemaker himself. And he found interest in missions after reading Captain Cook's book on exploration of the Pacific. And Captain Cook was an explorer. The Cook Islands are named after him in the Pacific. And he read this book and was very interested in missions. So in 1792, William Carey wrote a book, and it's called An Enquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen. And so that's a big mouthful and definitely a long title for a book. But he wrote this about how to take the gospel out to the heathen. And the book started a movement, and he and 11 others founded the Baptist Missionary Society. And you can see a picture of him there on the right. So within a year, he and his family finally do leave and go to India. They found it very difficult work. They landed on hard times when they got there, and he had to work in an indigo factory to make ends meet. And there was really no fruit of the mission. He was like telling people about Jesus, but there was no conversion going on, and that went on for a good number of years. And it was very hard on his wife and his family. It was so bad that his wife actually had a very debilitating mental breakdown, to where she became a big hindrance to the mission work that was going into India, and she really became a hindrance because of how bad her mental breakdown was. But it wasn't until some more missionaries came to help him out that things started kind of moving. This was two other missionary couples showed up and helped William Carey and his family, and they moved into a mission compound, and they called it the Serampore Trio because it was in Serampore, India. So the Serampore Trio mission compound began to see fruits. The gospel was being spread. There were converts being made. People were getting saved. There was education going on, being trained in the gospel, being trained in the Bible. And there was also a lot of translation work being done. And William Carey did a lot of that. He kind of sequestered himself and would go into translation work, while basically the other missionaries that were there at the compound had to deal with the behavior of his kids and still dealing with his wife. So it was just a very difficult time, but once the compound was established, these missionaries continued, and there was fruit being born. With the rise of the missions awareness and interest in early 19th century missions, Carey's mission became very well known, and all of these reports were coming back to Great Britain, back to England, and people were beginning to hear about this, and it started to really catch on. Almost a contagious movement begins for missions around the world. So there was definitely a big impact by William Carey. But we're going to look here at just kind of like moving in time a little bit into the early 19th century. And this is the missions movement that comes out of the Second Great Awakening. We're not going to talk about the Second Great Awakening as a missions movement itself because it was mainly just a large revival activity in the United States, in New York and Ohio and around the Midwest. And it was a time of fervent revival going on in the United States. And so obviously the gospel is going out, people are getting saved. But I'm not going to talk about the Second Great Awakening as a mission movement. But there was a mission movement that came out of the Second Great Awakening. Societies were being founded to promote the gospel. So it was not like a state church that supported the work, but it was supported by individual churches and even individual Christians. An example of this would be 1816. The American Bible Society is a society that was founded, and again, it was not some sort of organization that was promoted by the state. This was some churches would come together and promote it, or just individual Christians. And so you see an example there, 1816, the American Bible Society. But one of the things that I do want to mention here is the Haystack Prayer Meeting of 1806. This is very important for the missions movement in the United States. That comes out of the Second Great Awakening. 5 college students from Williams College met under a cluster of trees in Sloan's Meadow in Williamstown, Massachusetts, to discuss missions. That's what they were going to do. They were going to come together and just have a little chat with one another. But suddenly a thunderstorm breaks out and they run for shelter in a haystack. So the haystacks back then they would kind of like gather all the hay up into these big sheaves, and usually the tops would kind of like bow out and kind of give like an overhang. And so these guys got underneath of that overhang. You can see that artistic impression there of these guys under the overhang and the rain coming down and the lightning in the sky. And they're reading the Bible and praying there. But what happened was, as they discussed, now under a haystack with the rain coming down, they began to pray for a mission movement and vowed to give their lives to missions. And so this starts the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. And they actually begin a mission organization out of that prayer meeting. And this organization, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, sends Adoniram Judson to India. And he was one of the first sent from this organization, from the commission. But he goes to India. And after he becomes a Baptist, he actually comes to the belief that a person should be baptized as a believer instead of an infant on his way to India. But many Baptists came together and formed the General Convention to support missions. So that spot there in Massachusetts has kind of a personal connection with me. My wife and I were actually able to go on a Second Great Awakening tour, and we went around the Northeast. We went around Massachusetts and stopped at these great places where the Second Great Awakening occurred. And this is my wife and I at a monument that is at the exact same spot of the Haystack Prayer Meeting in Sloan's Meadow. Now that meadow today is actually a commons on a college campus. So this is a very important part of the mission movement. You can see the haystack carved there in the middle of the monument with the world on the top. Okay, so let's look at Africa. At the start of the 19th century, there were very few inroads into Africa. There was not much exploration into the center of Africa at all, even up into the 19th century. It was mainly just outposts along the coast. The Portuguese, they did some work in Angola and in Mozambique, but did not really extend inland. The Dutch had the Cape of Good Hope down in the south, but that was also coastal. Sierra Leone was founded by freed slaves that were freed by the British and then settled there. And then later on, the United States would actually send freed slaves from the United States back to Africa, and they settled Liberia, and that was the first inhabitants there of that colony. But you see that the most of the colonization that was taking place was just on the coast. So it was slow. But then the British took the Cape of Good Hope from the Dutch, and then they began to penetrate in a little bit more. But the interior of the majority of Africa was almost non-existent. Until 1867, there's diamonds that are discovered in South Africa. What happens is there is a mine, and they found some diamonds, and it actually becomes the Beers Diamond Mine. And Beers is one of the largest diamond producers in the world today. So it's been around a long time, and it's a diamond mine. Well, if you're finding diamonds, everyone's going to want to go there and find diamonds also. And so what we have is this phenomenon called the Scramble for Africa. And the European powers did not want Great Britain to gobble up all of Africa because they were already in South Africa, and now there's diamonds being found. They're going to want to explore more and have more opportunity to be able to explore further inland. And so the European powers got together and they divided Africa up. Between the 1880s and the start of World War I in 1914, almost all of Africa was divided up by the Europeans. And Africa becomes a missionary activity focal point. There's Catholic European powers that in Europe that had Catholic colonies and they sent Catholic missionaries. There's Protestant European powers in Europe and they sent missionaries to the Protestant colonies. However, most colonies did have a mix, and they had to coincide with one another where there were some Catholic missions going on next door to Protestant missions in these colonies. Here's just a graphic from 19th Century Magazine that shows the length of Africa and how the British were going to take over all of Africa. This man here is Cecil Rhodes, and it was his plan, or in quotes, his dream, because he really pushed for this, was to have a continuous line of British colonies from Egypt all the way down to South Africa and then connect it with a railway. That way they could have everything from South Africa go all the way up the continent to the Suez Canal and then come across the Mediterranean and back to Europe. But the British were going to control all of Africa. In fact, he was so powerful that there was a piece of land, a large tract of land in the southern portion of Africa, which was named after him, and the country became known as Rhodesia. And that was Rhodesia was for a long time, all the way until the 1960s, that it was settled independently by the indigenous peoples, and they got their independence from Great Britain, and it's today's Zimbabwe. But Rhodesia was named after him because of what an influence he had on the colonization of Africa, and missions were going to fly right behind all the colonizers. So here's a map of Africa in 1880, and you can just see all the people groups. The light green is just they didn't even know what was there, or they didn't know what people group was there. You see some things that are settled already by the 1880s. You see down at the bottom in South Africa it says Cape Colony, which is British. You see Mozambique over here where my arrow is. This is a dark green that says Portugal. Portugal over here with Angola. Over here you see Congo, which is basically this blue area, and that was French. That's going to go turn over to the Belgians in a different location though. And you just see a few other colonies along the coast here, but and all the rest are indigenous people groups. But by 1913, this is what Africa looks like, and it's all the European powers. And so you can see the colors over here. Just to point out real quick, United Kingdom is the pink, and so you have Egypt up here all the way down through, and then you link up again down here all the way to South Africa. The only thing that got in the way was this kind of olive green, and that is German. The German powers had this. This was German East Africa, and that hindered the British from actually connecting what Cecil Rhodes had as a plan. So you see all of this. Now this gigantic blue area, this is French. The vast majority of this is nothing but desert. This purple area is the Congo now. It's the center part of Africa, and this goes to the Belgians. And if you look at the size of Belgium, which is really, really tiny in Europe, they have this gigantic tract of land here in Central Africa. So you can see that the European powers just came in, divided it up. Actually, at a conference in 1886, they did this. They just sat down with a map and started drawing things on it, drawing lines on it, and settling Africa according to what they wanted. So you can see that now Europe basically controls Africa. Okay, so now I want to talk about David Livingstone here, 1813 and 1873. You see a picture of him there on the right. Now, he was Scottish, and he began his career as a missionary and then merged over to being a missionary/explorer. But he came to the northern frontier of South Africa in 1841 as a missionary. And he served with Robert Moffat, which was a very well-known older gentleman, older missionary there in the northern part of South Africa. And who had established a mission station among the Bantu people. And so David Livingstone decides to go and be a missionary there with Robert Moffat. Well, he ends up marrying Moffat's daughter, and they began to take missionary journeys even further north than Robert Moffat was. So he would move into these inner lands of South Africa, and he would take him and his wife and family with him on his journeys, and most of them were on rivers. They would get on a boat and they would move on rivers and through the area that way. But they would penetrate into these unknown areas and minister, and he got a heart for exploring. And it was very difficult for him because of the toll it took on his family. And it really was a hardship for his family as he took them around on his explorations and his mission work. Ruth Tucker, who wrote a book on missions, she says this in the book. On September 15th, 1851, a month after departure, Mary delivered her fifth child on the Zuga River, an event to which Livingstone devoted one line in his journal, leaving more space for his exciting discovery of crocodile eggs. Apparently ignoring his own culpability in the pregnancy of his wife, Livingstone bemoaned his wife's frequent pregnancies, comparing the results, meaning having children, to the output of the great Irish manufactory. So he definitely had a heart for exploring and was kind of dragging his family along with him. And here you can see that he wasn't even very excited to talk about his own child being born, more interested in crocodile eggs. So I thought that was just kind of a humorous quote there that Ruth Tucker has in her book. So he has this great interest in exploring. So what happens is he decides to send his family back to London, and he moves on with several expeditions that crisscrossed Africa, and it really opened up the interior of Africa, not just for more exploration, but for missions itself. He's the one that discovered Victoria Falls, the gigantic waterfalls in Africa. And while on one of the journeys that he was on, he went missing for 6 years, and most people thought he was dead. But he went missing for 6 years. He was just exploring away. And so an American journalist named Henry Morton Stanley decided he was going to go to Central Africa and try to find Livingstone and kind of track down his route and go find him. And he actually does. He finds Livingstone, and and when he goes up to him, he says the very famous phrase, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." And it's kind of a phrase that goes down in infamy when he finds him. And so there's like stories that come back because of this. They're written in the newspaper, they're written in journals, they're written in magazines. Missions societies are talking about it. Stories of danger and adventure. And what that does, that fuels exploration, and missions work in Africa. Well, he dies in Zambia, Africa, from malaria. And his two aides went and cut his heart out and buried his heart under a tree in Zambia. But then his body was taken back to London, and his body was buried in Westminster Abbey in London. And just a side note, Moffat, his father-in-law, actually outlived him, quite a bit older than him, and he attended the funeral in London. So just a really neat story. He was a good missionary. I'm not saying that he was a bad missionary. It's just that towards the end of it, the bug of exploration really bit him, and he really wanted to explore and take the mission and talk to people he found that way instead of just really focusing on mission work. So here's an image from a magazine from the 19th century, and it had been colorized, but this is just a lion jumping out at him, and you see the indigenous people in the background, and just adventure, and the young men would see this and be like, oh man, I can do this. I can go take the gospel out to these lands, and I can fight off the lion. And so you can see just adventure in those pictures. And then there's a map on the right-hand side of Livingstone's journeys. The red lines are his crisscrossing back and forth and just exploring all around there in Central Africa. All right, so here's Morton walking up and saying, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Okay, so let's look at South America. We really can't talk about missions in Africa without talking about South America also, because even though South America had already been settled by Europeans during the 17th century, there was still a lot of South America that was not really penetrated with the gospel. The colonies in South America were predominantly Catholic. What happens is the European Protestant missionaries went to South America, and they basically had a hands-off approach at first, but then they got more into it, because what would happen is if they were going to South America and saying you need the gospel, they were really inferring that Catholics were not even Christians, and most of them were not really willing to take that stance back in Europe. And of course, there's the theological differences between Protestants and Catholics. And if you have a works-based salvation on Catholicism, really that is no salvation, because it's only through the blood of Jesus Christ, not receiving grace through sacraments or through the church. And so, there was a hands-off approach at first, especially by the Anglicans and Episcopalians, because they were very Catholic-like. The Anglicans is the Church of England, looks a lot like a Catholic church, but it's just a Protestant church. And then the Episcopalians are the American version of Anglicans, again, very Catholic-like. So if they showed up and say, you need the gospel, they're really inferring that the Catholics were not Christians. However, in the 20th century, Protestant missions did begin to make some inroads. So we're kind of moving out of the 19th century. We're actually going to finish up this PowerPoint talking about the 20th century. But they made inroads into the cities, into the indigenous people groups, into the jungle on the Amazon with mission work on the Amazon River. There was missional aviation where airplanes were penetrating the dense jungle, landing on a sandbar in a river or a little clearing. There was educational opportunities to share missions, medicine missions, church planting was going on all around. So there was definitely inroads being made in the 20th century. But one thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about Operation Auca and finish up this PowerPoint. Now we're getting into January of the mid 20th century, 1956. So even though we're looking at 19th century missions, we can't overlook what takes place in South America, because of it was just such a well-known event that really launches more mission opportunities and more mission work. There were 5 evangelical missionary families from the United States who moved to Ecuador. Their names were Jim Elliot, Nate Saint, who was the pilot, Ed McCauley, Peter Fleming, and Roger Udarian. And these were 5 missionary men who were believers. They took their families to Ecuador, and they were going to reach the Auca Indians. Their mission was to reach the primitive Auca Indians with the gospel. After locating the people group from the air, they dropped gifts down to them for several months to try to open that door, and just that they were not any kind of threat to the people group, but just dropping gifts. On January 3rd, 1956, they established a base camp on a sandbar of the river where they were dropping the gifts. And then January 6th and 7th, they made initial contact with the Auca Indians in Ecuador. So here's a picture of these men: Roger Udarian on the left, Peter Fleming, Jim Elliot in the center, Nate Saint, who was the pilot, and then Ed McCauley. On January 8th, as the men were on the sandbar on the beach of the river, the Aucas came out of the jungle and attacked these 5 and killed all 5 of the missionaries. A rescue mission found the dismantled plane and 4 of the bodies. McCauley's body was never found. But these men were killed, martyred for Christ, and the mission and the rescue mission did find the plane that Nate Saint was the pilot of, all dismantled. And you can see there on the right-hand side, Nate Saint with an Auca Indian on the sandbar. This picture was taken one day before the massacre. And so you can see the actual plane there in the background that they would fly, and they were actually killed the next day. But there was a model plane that Nate Saint brought with him to kind of show what it looked like, because the Indians actually called it the Yellow Bee. They didn't know what the airplane was that had landed. So anyway, there's a picture there the day before the massacre. Well, this captured the attention of the United States, especially in missional news and in Baptist circles and across the country. And what happens, it fuels more missions. Many people go to the mission field and get interested in missions because of Operation Auca. One of the things that takes place is Rachel Saint, which is Nate Saint's sister, the pilot's sister, with the help of an Auca girl, returned to the Auca Indians, and she evangelized the tribe. And most of the tribe accepted Jesus Christ under the evangelization of Rachel Saint. And people that got saved were those that killed the missionaries. And it became such national coverage that Life magazine actually did a story on it in 1956. And this is the spread there on the right hand side: "Go ye and preach the gospel, 5 do and die." And the picture there is the missionary wives back at the base camp, or the base compound where the missionaries lived, their families lived in Ecuador. The missionary wives were informed that their husbands were all dead. And that picture was taken right after that news was broken to them. So you can see, obviously, on the left, I'm not sure who is who. I guess if you could read the small print, you'd be able to find out. But these are the missionary wives and the missionary kids. And one of these, and I think this boy here, you can see him right there. I believe that's Nate Saint's son. And that's him there on the right, Nate Saint's son, who is Steve Saint, who was a boy when his father was killed. He stands with Minkaya, who is one of the Auca Indians that killed his father. And Minkaya came to become a believer under Rachel Saint's ministry to the Auca Indians. And he becomes a believer in Christ. And this Indian man here, Minkaya, he entered heaven in 2020 when he died. And so you could say this is all because of these 5 missionaries who went and were martyred, and the gospel then penetrated this people group, and even the killers were saved by Jesus. Okay, so that is it for this PowerPoint. I'll see you in a second. All right, class, that's it for today, and that finishes up our look at the history of missional strategies. And next time we're going to start part 3 of our course, which is titled Foundations. And the first topic we'll be looking at is entry. I'll see you then.